I never considered myself a particularly skilled person, but I always had an insatiable desire to learn. It started when I stumbled upon a subreddit dedicated to a peculiar form of shadow puppetry. The users there described a technique that supposedly could unlock the secrets of storytelling without words, but of course, they were also discussing it in a way that felt grimmer than your usual art forum. Some boasted about how they had perfected these shadow tricks over time, mesmerized their friends, even haunted their neighbors with the eerily lifelike silhouettes. I was captivated, engrossed by tales of how the shadows could take on a life of their own, turning benign shapes into grotesque figures that suggested more than they showed. Intrigued, I fell down the rabbit hole and found a few tutorials, which explained the essential techniques: hand positioning, light sources, manipulation of space. I decided I wanted to master it, but I realized it would take hours of practice to even come close to what the practitioners on that subreddit could achieve. That's where the obsessive part of my personality kicked in. I started to practice in my basement after work, shoving the old furniture against the walls to make the perfect blank canvas. Each night, I would refine my technique. I became so absorbed that my daily cleaning routine and even simple meals fell by the wayside. Gradually, I began to create haunting representations that sent chills down my own spine. On the third night of my practice, I created a shadow of something truly unsettling. I stood in front of the light, casting a figure that looked eerily like a child with elongated limbs and an impossibly wide grin. The moment I formed that grin, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, even though all the windows were shut. Chills raced down my arms, but I brushed it off. Perhaps I was just overthinking things. After all, that could easily be explained as a draft or the house settling. But as I continued to refine my technique, I couldn't shake the odd feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Days turned into weeks, and I honed the craft. Where I had started by practicing basic shapes, I was now constructing entire narratives. But every night, the atmosphere in the basement grew heavier. Shadows seemed to flicker as they danced on the walls, forming shapes that I had not controlled. Mysterious whispers filled my ears, almost like voices murmuring secrets. Each time I thought about stopping or taking a break, I felt as though I would lose that momentum, that connection I had forged with whatever it was manifesting in those dark corners. I found myself growing more and more paranoid, convinced that if I didn't practice each evening, the shadows would disappear forever, taking with them the enigmatic energy I had come to rely on. As Halloween approached, I decided to host a small gathering for a few close friends. I wanted to show them my progress, but I couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that gloomed over every advanced shadow I cast. The day of the gathering, I spent hours preparing. I made sure to only invite friends who appreciated art and could maintain an open mind about the strange practices I'd engaged in. That night, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared and darkness seeped into the corners of the room, my friends entered the basement, naive to the dread that lingered. I started with simple shapes, using an old lamp as my only light source. They laughed along with my attempts, but it wasn't until I unveiled my favorite creation, the elongated child, when things took a turn. As I formed the shadows, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter faded into stunned silence. The shadow of that creature filled the wall, and an unnatural chill crept into the room. A muffled screech echoed, but not from me. My friends' faces twisted into expressions of horror as they caught sight of something beyond my control. The shadow of the creature was beginning to morph. It formed into something reclining, half-formed against the edges of the lampshade, as if it were emerging from the darkness itself. In a panic, I waved my arms, trying to push the dark figure back, but it only seemed to encourage it. Its grin stretched wider, impossibly so, and suddenly, the shadows in the room darkened unnaturally. They whispered my name. Someone shouted for the light to be turned on, and one of my friends stumbled over to flip the switch. But the bulb flickered, overwhelmed by a surge of darkness. The room erupted into chaos, with my friends screaming as they bolted toward the stairs. I was frozen, paralyzed in a blend of panic and fascination. I couldn't understand what was happening. My shadows, the things I had created, were turning against me. I reached for the light again, desperate to break the spell that had taken hold of my guests. But when I finally flicked the switch, I was met with silence. The shadows were gone, and only my trembling friends remained, huddled against each other in terror. They would later tell me that while the creature hadn't been corporeal, they could still feel its malice. We never spoke of that night again. Friends drifted away, and the once warm laughter vanished from my house, leaving me with my craft. I withdrew deeper into the shadows, practicing more than ever, hoping to regain that connection. I soon discovered that the more I practiced, the more the darkness responded. I could shape it, it obeyed and resisted me in equal measures. I was not just experiencing shadows anymore, I was conversing with something far darker, tracking the contours of its gloom with my hands. I became a vessel for creating phantoms. Months passed as I spiraled deeper into the abyss of this learning. I honed my craft to the point where the line between my creations and the shadows of the room blurred. I no longer looked for approval or understanding from anyone else, I just felt the need to create. One fateful evening, I became obsessed with crafting the figure of a woman, her silhouette draped in a flowing gown. As I worked, a whisper slipped through my consciousness, its tone both alluring and malicious, and I followed it like a moth drawn to flame. I finally manifested that figure, and as I did so, her shadows enveloped me, pulling me into darkness as if desiring my very essence. The last thought I had before everything went black was the realization that I had encouraged something to take form, something I could no longer control, and in my endeavor to develop a new skill through relentless practice, I had lost myself completely. And now, I live in the shadows, forever practicing what I can no longer master. When I witnessed an act of kindness, a heartwarming story. It was a cold, bleak afternoon when I witnessed something that would stay with me for the rest of my life, a moment of kindness that still feels unreal, even as I sit here reflecting on it. I was walking home from work, the wind biting at my skin as I hunched into my coat, trying to shield myself from the chill. It had been a tough week. I had been under a lot of stress at work, juggling more tasks than usual, and I hadn't had much time for myself. The streets were busy as usual, with people rushing by, each of them lost in their own little world. I was used to the anonymity of the city, where you could walk down the street and hardly anyone would make eye contact, let alone speak to you. As I walked past a small park, I saw a woman sitting on a bench, hunched over, her face buried in her hands. At first, I thought nothing of it, maybe she was just having a bad day, maybe she was tired. But as I got closer, I noticed that her clothes were tattered and worn, her shoes almost falling apart. She looked like she hadn't had a proper meal in days. There was something in the way she sat, her shoulders slumped, that made my heart ache. I slowed my pace, unsure of what to do. I was just about to turn away when I saw a man approach her. He wasn't wearing anything particularly special, just a regular jacket and jeans, but there was something about him that drew my attention. He stopped a few feet away from the woman, and for a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. I could tell the woman was startled, like she didn't expect anyone to approach her. I felt a strange wave of tension in the air. The man then knelt down in front of her, gently touching her arm. The woman flinched at first, like she was afraid he was going to harm her, but then she looked up at him. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told me everything. The man's posture was calm, reassuring. He didn't look at her with pity or judgment, he looked at her with empathy, like he saw her as a fellow human being, not someone to be ignored or avoided. After a moment, the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope. He handed it to the woman, who looked at it in confusion, unsure of what to make of the gesture. But when she opened the envelope, her eyes widened in surprise. Inside was a small amount of cash, enough to buy a meal or maybe even a couple of days' worth of groceries. She looked up at the man, her face a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. She stammered something, but I couldn't make out the words. The man simply nodded, giving her a warm, understanding smile. Then, without saying anything else, he stood up and began to walk away. The woman watched him go, still holding the envelope in her hands, almost as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, unsure of how to process what I had just witnessed. It was such a simple act, yet so profound. He hadn't given her anything extravagant, just a small amount of money, but it was the way he did it that stuck with me. It wasn't about the money, it was about the human connection, the way he saw her and chose to help her without hesitation. It was a moment that reminded me that kindness still exists in this world, even in places where we least expect it. I continued on my way home, my mind racing with a mixture of awe and confusion. I didn't know why the act had impacted me so much. Maybe it was because I was so used to the cold, detached world around me, where everyone kept to themselves and the hustle of daily life made it easy to ignore the struggles of others. Maybe it was because I had been feeling so disconnected lately, too caught up in my own problems to notice what was happening around me. But witnessing that moment changed something in me. I started to pay more attention to the people around me, the small gestures of kindness that go unnoticed, the way a smile from a stranger can brighten your day, the way a simple "how are you?" can make someone feel seen. It made me realize how easy it is to make a difference, even in small ways. I don't know who that man was or what led him to help that woman, but I'll never forget the way he treated her. It reminded me that kindness doesn't have to be a grand gesture. Sometimes, it's just about being there for someone, showing them that they matter. A few days later, I found myself walking through that same park again, and to my surprise, I saw the woman sitting on the bench again. But this time, she was smiling. She wasn't hunched over, her hands weren't covering her face. She looked like she had more energy, more life in her. She saw me walking by, and for the first time, she didn't look down or avoid eye contact. She gave me a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that something had changed. It wasn't just the money that had made a difference. It was the kindness, the connection. The belief that someone cared enough to help her, to treat her with dignity. It was a reminder that we're all just people, trying to make it through this world the best we can. The act of kindness I witnessed that day wasn't some life-altering moment. It wasn't some earth-shattering revelation. But it was exactly what I needed to see at that point in my life, a reminder that even in a world that often feels cold and indifferent, there are still people who choose to make it warmer. And for that, I will always be grateful. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation that would change my life forever, but there I was, standing in a dimly lit room, surrounded by strangers, 6 of them to be exact, and we were all crammed into what might as well have been a haunted house. Instead, it was a dilapidated cabin somewhere deep in the woods, far away from civilization. My heart raced, not just from the ghostly ambience but because we were there for a purpose. Each of us had received a strange invite to this group. I wasn't even sure how they found me. Just like everyone else in the room, we all felt this bizarre pull to be there, drawn by the promise of learning how to communicate better in dire circumstances. I should have known it would turn ugly. The 5 others introduced themselves, their faces reflecting a spectrum of mixed emotions, nervousness, excitement, and a hint of dread. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made you feel like you were perpetually on the edge of your seat. I wasn't entirely sure what to expect as our focus turned to the host, a lanky man who introduced himself as Jacob. He looked the part of a charlatan, all disheveled hair and eyes that darted around like he was trying to make sense of his own ideas. Without preamble, he began to explain that we were there to participate in a radical form of communication training. As he spoke, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. There were rumors swirling around our town about Jacob, a man known for orchestrating bizarre social experiments that often ended in chaos. It was almost like he craved unpredictability, creating tense scenarios to stress-test relationships. Before I could process my thoughts, Jacob dropped the bombshell: we'd be simulating a dangerous hostage situation. The rules were simple: we had to communicate effectively to defuse the situation and successfully rescue a presumably captured person, who Jacob would appoint. My heart sank. Was this really what I signed up for? But before I could voice my dissent, he announced the first exercise. He instructed one of the others, a calm-looking woman who introduced herself as Lily, to act as the hostage. The rest of us had to roleplay as the negotiators, and tensions soared the moment the fake gun was introduced. Jacob acted as the threat, pacing like a caged animal with that maniacal glint in his eyes. The chaos unfolded rapidly. I remember clearly trying to communicate in a way that would resonate with the threat, my palms sweating profusely as I fumbled through my words. The reality was terrifying. Despite being a simulated exercise, it felt real. Lily's eyes widened in fear, the pretend scenario taking on a life of its own. Jacob stared us down with unyielding intensity, demanding we find common ground with the hostage-taker. I struggled, feeling the weight of the group's expectations as I attempted to maintain composure. Voices clashed in the fray, everybody clamoring for their chance to talk. The more we spoke, the angrier Jacob became, wielding his gun in exaggerated wild movements while mocking our attempts. The energy shifted sharply to chaos. At one point, I yelled out, desperate to be heard. I remember looking at Jacob, his twisted smile sending chills down my spine, as he pointed his prop weapon at me. As we floundered and fought, I noticed another participant, a quiet guy named Mark, who seemed to be observing rather than participating. I felt a strange kinship with him, but even then, any thoughts of camaraderie were drowned in the overwhelming anxiety of the scenario. The cries grew louder. There was a distinct chance that we could all emerge worse than we entered this labyrinth of manipulation, but as feelings of frustration escalated into palpable fear, something inside me snapped. I stepped forward, commanding attention in a shaky voice. Wait. Everyone, stop. We need to breathe. Time seemed to freeze for just a moment as the shifting faces turned toward me with a mix of confusion and hope. I didn't even know where this newfound courage came from, but the words flowed. This isn't helping anyone. Jacob, you're being too aggressive. We're not going to get anywhere this way. The air shifted, the tension dissipating like steam from a pot. Jacob's smile faltered for just a second, and I seized the opportunity to elaborate. I directed my gaze at Lily, linking eyes with her. I whispered, we're going to get you out of here. We just need to talk. The others echoed this sentiment, and for the first time in hours, everyone appeared willing to collaborate. Jacob stood there, looking bewildered, as if the very essence of the exercise was unraveling before his eyes. I realized that's all I had to do, intervene when things spiraled and bridge the gap with heartfelt communication. It wasn't just about the words, it was the spirit behind them. I gathered myself, looking at each face and sharing the truth of our shared experience. We were all scared. Jacob's demeanor shifted, his game revealed. The situation didn't have to maintain this frantic pace. As our collective anxiety began to change its shape, Jacob, rather than fighting it, something shifted in him too. He dropped the facade, nodding slowly, biting his lip as if working through a revelation of his own. One by one, others began to reflect on their feelings, sharing genuine vulnerabilities. We were no longer just role-playing, we were building a bridge. As the night drew on, the timer, which had been counting down, blinked successively to 0. It was the first time I felt authentic communication flowing in a way I had only hoped it would. It wasn't just a lesson about techniques or strategies, it was a raw glimpse into human connection. To my shock, Jacob, who had been so set on chaos, admitted that his entire experiment had come from a place of fear, his own doubts about interpersonal relationships, something almost unfathomable given his earlier demeanor. It became clear we were all fighting battles that needed our voices to transcend them. Communication is not simply about being articulate, it's about vulnerability, understanding, and knowing when to step back. The hostage scenario ended, but my lessons had just begun. After that night, I found myself reaching out in ways I'd never imagined. I transformed how I navigated conflict, how I connected with loved ones, and how I truly listened. Even when I left that dilapidated cabin, the most haunting realization lingered. Learning to communicate effectively isn't just a skill, it's a profound journey that intertwines with the very core of who we are. The truth is, I walked in expecting a shallow list of tricks. Instead, I stumbled upon raw honesty, and in that little cabin in the woods, I found the courage to face not only others but also my own fears. Ultimately, that night taught me the most crucial lesson of all. In difficult situations, it's not so much about winning a conversation as it is about nurturing the human connection. I still carry that with me today, trying to communicate effectively, even in the midst of a storm. I still remember the day my life changed forever, though it feels surreal to replay it over and over in my mind. It started like any other day, just a notch above mundane, packed with the repetitive cycle of waking up, getting dressed, and heading into work. I rushed through breakfast, hardly tasting the toast I shoved down my throat, all the while planning the 10 other things I needed to check off my list before jumping into bed that night. My commute felt more like a robotic maneuver than a girl in a city filled with beautiful moments. I was obsessed with speed and productivity, and life began to feel like a never-ending race. That's when the accident happened. The screeching tires, the crunching metal, the horrified cries of passers-by, everything happened so fast, yet time stretched infinitesimally in front of me as I sat in my car, paralyzed, gripping the wheel. I don't even know who was in the other vehicle, all I could think was the sheer terror of injury and potential loss. But when the shock subsided, I realized how lucky I was. My car was totaled, but I emerged with nothing more than a bruised ego and a cut on my forehead that throbbed irritably. After the adrenaline wore off, I was left staring at the shattered glass around me, but strangely, I could feel a gentle breeze. It did something to me. Suddenly, for a reason that baffled me, the world seemed crisp and vivid. The blues of the sky melted my heart. The greens of the trees became electric. The conversations around me transformed into a symphony that filled my ears, but busy thoughts of deadlines came crashing back in. I was no longer just a woman who worked, consumed with success and ticking boxes. I started to notice the little things I had ignored for too long. For the first time in years, I looked forward to simple pleasures. Lunchtime strolls replaced hurried dinners. As weeks passed post-accident, I began spending weekends with my niece. Together we built sand castles on the beach, decorated them with shells and seaweed, and waited for the waves to destroy them. I watched her laugh, the kind of laugh that could only emerge from completely losing oneself in the moment, and I felt a twinge of envy. She was living a life I had forgotten existed. I started snapping pictures of our adventures, the way the sunlight danced in her hair, how she would scrunch her nose in pure delight after diving into the surf. I realized I wanted to capture not just memories, but the joy that glimmered within those fleeting seconds. One day, we decided to go to the local ice cream shop, a tiny place with peeling paint and a squeaky door, the kind that pulls you back to your childhood. While I waited in line, the smell of fresh waffle cones washed over me. I could hear the chatter of kids, their laughter slicing through the air like warm sunlight. My niece tugged at my sleeve, eagerly pulling me to the front, where she demanded cotton candy blue with sprinkles. As we stepped outside, she suddenly twirled in a dress that caught the wind, the world behind her bursting with color like a rainbow after rain. It struck me, she was embracing every moment. Then it hit like a wave, what if I didn't get to share all these moments with her? I thought back to that accident, it could have taken everything away. I had to learn to savor life, to savor each second before it slipped through my fingers. Fast forward to that stormy Saturday not too long ago, I woke up longing for a cozy day beneath the covers, but I couldn't shake an unsettling feeling. It tugged at my heart, warning me that someone very close to me was about to leave this world. I brushed it aside. To be honest, that kind of intuition had never served me well. I opted instead for a spontaneous cafe run. On my way, I noticed an elderly man struggling where the sidewalk met the street. He was attempting to carry more bags than he could manage, bread and fresh vegetables teetering precariously as he hobbled along. I hesitated, on the edge of resolving my internal struggle, but managed to intervene just in time, offering my help. To my surprise, he beamed, a smile so wide it felt infectious. He introduced himself as Mr. Thompson and invited me to share a seat at his favorite cafe down the street. I agreed, intrigued. Over warm muffins and steaming coffee, he spoke about his life, sharing stories of his wife, Clara, who had passed 5 years prior. Each memory he recounted overflowed with love, not sadness. I lost track of time, blinking back tears and smiling, laughing in tandem as we exchanged stories. Hours melted away until I finally noticed the sun setting in hues I had long overlooked, pouring golden light through the cafe window. His hands trembled slightly as he told me about Clara's laughter, how she would dance in the kitchen, twirling so effortlessly, leading him to join her and their children. I learned about how he expressed his love in the smallest of moments, folding laundry, preparing her favorite meals, savoring first-hand experiences while they played cards every Wednesday night. Suddenly, I remembered the feeling I had on the day of my accident. Life was fleeting, but we could either race through it like I had done for so long, or embrace it. When I finally left Mr. Thompson, the weight that had once pressed down on my chest was gone. It dawned on me then just how precious my little moments had become. The rush of love for life, for the people in it, made me understand something essential. Appreciation isn't just about what you see or do, it's feeling everything more deeply, experiencing the ordinary with breathless gratitude. I learned the risk that comes with focusing too much on future plans while letting these beautiful little moments slip away. That stormy Saturday marked a turning point. I invested in a new camera, not as a tool but as a lens through which I wanted to ensure I would remember every little laugh, every twirl of my niece, every story shared over coffee. The changes that blossomed quietly within me echoed loud and profound. This is how I learned to appreciate life's little moments, through the simplicity of connection, through the mundane, and the extraordinary that we often forget. In a world of chaos, each second gifted to us is not just a second but a chance. A chance to live richly, to breathe deeply, to love wholly. So now, I stand here with a heart expanding at the thought of living, and if you're still racing through life, I suggest you stop. Because the smallest of moments might just be the ones you never wanted to let go of. Don't wait until your car crashes to realize that. Embrace the moment. Live it. You never know how fleeting it may be. How I found closure after a difficult breakup, my journey. It's funny how life can suddenly shift on its axis, how one moment you can be blissfully in love, and the next you're standing at the edge of a chasm, unsure if you'll ever be able to climb out. I used to believe that I understood heartbreak, but nothing could have prepared me for the devastation I felt after my breakup. My ex and I had been together for nearly 4 years, and though we weren't perfect, I genuinely believed we would make it through anything. That was until the day she sat me down and told me she wasn't happy anymore. I could see the pain in her eyes, but what hit hardest was the sense of finality in her voice. She told me that she had tried, but she just couldn't keep pretending. There was no dramatic fight, no major betrayal, it was simply an overwhelming feeling that something had died between us, something neither of us could revive. The days that followed felt like a blur. I tried to keep myself busy, surrounding myself with friends and family, pretending like I was fine. But I wasn't. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the thought that everything I had built with her, everything I had believed in, had just disappeared. I found myself constantly checking my phone, hoping for some sign, some message, that maybe we could fix things. But nothing came. Slowly, I realized that I had to let go. I had to accept that this chapter of my life was over, even though every fiber of my being screamed to hold on. One evening, a few weeks after the breakup, I decided to take a walk. The weather was cooler, the leaves just beginning to turn, and something about the stillness of the evening made me feel like I could think clearly for the first time in weeks. I wandered aimlessly for a while, my thoughts consumed with memories of her, the way she laughed, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams. I missed her, and it hurt to know that those moments were gone. But as I walked, something unexpected happened. I found myself taking in the world around me in a way I hadn't in months. I watched a couple walking hand in hand, and instead of feeling a pang of jealousy, I felt a sense of peace. I could feel the weight of the loss starting to lift, just a little. The more I walked, the more I realized that life was still happening, and even though my relationship had ended, the world hadn't stopped turning. I didn't need to hold on to the past to keep moving forward. That night, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would focus on healing, on rediscovering who I was outside of the relationship. I wasn't going to rush the process, and I wasn't going to try to force closure. I knew it would come in its own time. Over the next few months, I threw myself into work and hobbies I had put on hold for far too long. I started running again, something I used to love but had stopped doing when we started dating. The physical exhaustion helped clear my mind, and, for the first time, I felt like I was reconnecting with myself. I also spent more time with my friends, really leaning on them when I needed support, and it was through their encouragement that I started to get out of my head. They made me laugh when I thought I would never smile again, and their constant reminders that I was worthy of love helped me rebuild my self-esteem. But even with all this progress, there were moments when the loneliness hit hard. There were nights when I'd lay in bed and wish things had turned out differently. But rather than spiraling into despair, I learned to sit with that pain. I let myself feel it, not to wallow in it, but to acknowledge that it was a part of my healing. I began to understand that healing wasn't linear. It wasn't about completely erasing the pain, but learning to live with it, to find peace with the past. Then came the day I least expected it. I had been sitting at a coffee shop, lost in a book, when I heard a familiar voice. I looked up and saw her standing there. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. She smiled awkwardly, and I could tell she was unsure whether she should approach me. I put down my book and nodded for her to come over. When she sat down, we exchanged a few pleasantries, but I could sense that there was something more to this meeting. She looked at me with a mixture of regret and sadness, and she admitted that she had been thinking about me a lot lately. She told me she hadn't expected the breakup to affect her as much as it had, but it had. She had spent the last few months reflecting on herself, on us, and she realized that she hadn't been fair to me, that she had been running away from the hard conversations instead of facing them. I listened quietly, not because I was still in love with her, but because I wanted to hear her words. I had spent so many months in my own head, imagining what she might be thinking or feeling, that hearing it from her, hearing her take responsibility for her part, gave me the closure I didn't even realize I needed. When she finished, there was a long pause. I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me wanted to scream, to ask why she had waited so long to tell me these things. But I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath and told her that I had been doing okay, that I was healing. I told her that I had learned a lot about myself, about what I wanted and needed in a relationship. I thanked her for being honest, but I also told her that I had come to terms with the fact that we weren't right for each other. That moment, sitting across from her in that coffee shop, was the final step in my healing process. I had let go. I didn't feel anger or bitterness, I simply felt peace. I realized that sometimes, closure doesn't come from the other person apologizing or making amends. Sometimes, closure is about accepting that things didn't work out the way you hoped and finding peace with that. I walked away from that conversation knowing that I was stronger than I had been when the breakup first happened. I had faced my pain head-on, and I had come out the other side. And as I walked down the street, I felt a sense of lightness that I hadn't felt in months. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, I knew I was going to be okay. There was a time in my life when things just seemed too easy. I was coasting through my late teens in a haze of indifference. My friends and I had a routine. We'd meet up at the old abandoned factory just outside of town, a place we claimed was haunted. None of us believed the stories about a man who had vanished in its shadows or whispers of a girl in white drifting through the crumbling walls, but we gravitated there anyway, daring each other to creep deeper into its maze of rusted metal and shattered glass. It was during one of these impromptu adventure nights that I found something strange. The group had split up, as usual, and I wandered off, feeling cocky. I'd always been the one not to retreat in fear. I stumbled upon an old filing cabinet stuffed with yellowing documents, pages rotting but still legible, revealing a dark past of shady experiments and missing persons. As I flicked through those pages, the names meant nothing to me, until I came across one that sent a chill down my spine. It was my own name, scrawled awkwardly in faded ink alongside a date, my date of birth. At that moment, I felt like the walls were closing in on me, and I bolted from the factory, panic clawing at my throat. I brushed it off as some sick joke, but the nagging feeling remained. Shortly after, I did something unthinkable. I shared a photo from that night on social media, claiming I had found something supernatural, exaggerating the whole experience to gain likes. I took pride in the engagement it brought. People were commenting and sharing like I was some kind of urban legend creator. But that night, it felt real. I began receiving messages from people who claimed they had been affected, strangers sharing tales of shadowy figures and eerie noises haunting their homes. I blocked them, thinking they were just trying to piggyback on my moment of fame. But they kept coming back with the same story about something lurking, something that came for them when they least expected it. I laughed it off until one night, I heard a scratching noise outside my window. My heart raced. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, but the sound persisted. I drew the curtains and stared into the dark, my breath catching in my throat as I saw a figure standing in my yard, its form indistinct but eerily familiar. I shut my eyes tightly, convincing myself I was just imagining it. The scratching stopped, but my mind was spinning. Had I invited this entity into my life with my careless words? Over the weeks that followed, the visits didn't stop, only they became more disturbing. My friends were now threatened, each recounting their own horror stories that matched the strange occurrences in my life. One friend was convinced she found an actual voicemail on her phone from me, except her phone showed that I never called her. Another woke up to find her entire room rearranged in patterns that shouldn't be possible. The group was slowly unraveling, each of us fearing what we'd unleashed. Clarity broke through my stubbornness when I realized the references to my name weren't merely coincidence, they were a warning. I wanted to reach out to those who had contacted me, but now I felt too much shame. I was the one who had fueled this by spinning a story for a few cheap thrills. During a confrontation in the factory, my friends attempted to confront me about my responsibility. The air was thick with accusations, the accusations that only made my shame deeper. "You opened something, and now we're cursed," Amanda shouted. But I was too stubborn, too proud to admit that I was the one who had set this all in motion. How could I? I turned away, even while a dark shadow began creeping behind them. I shook my head, trying to deny the darkness. Yet there it loomed, large, swirling, a malevolent presence formed of our collective fear. It reached out and grasped Amanda, dragging her into the darkness with a blood-curdling scream that sent shivers down my spine. I had thought it was all a prank, something that would fade away like a viral trend. But what stood before me was pure terror, tangible and merciless. I couldn't let it take me too, I couldn't let my actions extend their reach any further. Without thinking, I lunged back towards the very filing cabinet where I first found the documents. It felt ridiculous, like I was searching for some mystical solution to erase my sins. But as I threw open the cabinet doors, I was greeted with the same old papers and a bitter recollection of the warning they provided. I grabbed a crumpled sheet, my heart pounding as I skimmed through names. Among them, I found a pattern. All involved had one thing in common: they'd engaged with the shadows, unknowingly warning others just to get a glimpse of the thrill. I remembered one name, Helena, an urban legend of a girl who disappeared near the factory years ago. It dawned on me that all along, I had been casting my own shadow on her story. In that overwhelming moment of guilt, I began to cry out her name with a mantra, pleading for her forgiveness. Helena, I'm sorry. Please, I can't let this continue. As I shouted, the entity paused, releasing Amanda, who fell to the ground gasping. My heart raced as it spoke, not with words, but through the echoing shadows that murmured and resonated throughout the factory. You face the consequences of your actions, return what you have taken. Suddenly, the shadows began to retreat, spiraling back into one large mass hovering above my head. It was a tornado of energy, and it wanted retribution. I clutched Amanda and dragged her from the visible chaos, the weight of my regret forcing every step. I would face this alone. I returned to the factory, clutching that crumpled document, screaming until losing my voice, murmuring the names written on the faded pages, hoping it would appease the darkness I had called. Helena, I'm sorry. I begged. Please forgive us. The shadows slowly receded with my words, turning into mist around me, until finally, they collapsed, taking the remnants of my carelessness with them. The weight lifted, but at what cost? The people I cared for were still shaken, our friendship irreparably damaged, but at least I could breathe. I walked away from that factory forever changed, a lesson learned in gravity and respect. Those who challenge the facade of legends need to realize they affect the very fabric of the stories we tell. Facing the consequences of my actions wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I now understood that sometimes, the darkness isn't just a story, but a warning waiting to be heeded. My family's reaction to my career choice, you won't believe it. My family's reaction to my career choice, you won't believe it. I never thought my career choice would lead to such a huge rift with my family, especially since I'd always been close to them. Growing up, there was this unspoken rule in our family that we'd follow respectable paths. My dad was a surgeon, my mom a successful lawyer, and even my older siblings took traditional routes. One became a banker, and the other a professor. So, when I first announced my decision to them, I didn't expect an easy conversation, but I didn't anticipate the intensity of their response either. I'd been in school for a few years, dutifully studying pre-med like they wanted, going through the motions even though I knew deep down it wasn't for me. Every biology lecture, every chemistry lab, and every hour spent buried in medical textbooks felt like I was sinking further away from myself. Then, in my second year, I stumbled into an elective art class, just needing something to break up the monotony, something that would give me a breath of fresh air from the heavy science load. But that class changed everything. Suddenly, I felt alive. Sketching, painting, sculpting, everything about it felt right, like I'd finally found what I was meant to do. I started spending more time in the studio, working late nights, skipping study sessions, missing family calls because I was too engrossed in my latest piece. It wasn't long before I made the decision to drop pre-med altogether and pursue art full-time. I wanted to break the news gently, so I planned a family dinner. They all arrived, looking proud and expectant, thinking I'd be sharing my plans for med school applications. I took a deep breath and told them I'd made a decision about my future. I'm going to be an artist, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, thinking that if I sounded confident, they'd accept it. Silence filled the room. My dad's face fell, and my mom just stared, like I'd spoken a foreign language. My older brother laughed, thinking I was joking, and when I didn't laugh with him, his face turned cold. An artist. My mom finally said, her voice laced with disappointment. Do you know how hard we've worked to give you this opportunity? And you're throwing it all away for painting. My dad's reaction was even worse. He stood up, not saying a word, just shaking his head as he left the table. I could feel my chest tighten as I watched them all turn away, unable or unwilling to understand. They kept calling my decision a phase, a waste of my potential, a betrayal of the family's legacy. For weeks, they tried everything to change my mind. They held interventions, bringing in family friends and mentors to talk me out of it. They reminded me of every sacrifice they'd made, of the dreams they'd had for me since I was a kid. They stopped helping with my tuition, thinking financial pressure would bring me to my senses. But instead, it made me more determined. I started working 2 part-time jobs just to stay afloat, sacrificing sleep and social life to keep myself in school. I'd spend my nights in the art studio, often crying from the exhaustion but never once regretting my decision. My work improved, and soon, I was invited to participate in a local art showcase. I thought maybe this would be my chance to show my family I was serious, that I wasn't just playing around. I invited them, even though I was terrified they wouldn't come. On the night of the show, I scanned the crowd, hoping to see familiar faces, but they didn't come. Instead, they texted me after, saying they were disappointed and didn't want to support a mistake. I felt crushed, but I poured that pain into my art. My work started getting noticed, and I even sold a few pieces. A well-known gallery offered to feature me, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe I'd prove them wrong. Months passed, and I continued to struggle, balancing work, school, and my art. Then, one evening, as I was preparing for my gallery debut, my mom showed up at my apartment unannounced. She looked around at my cramped space, at the walls covered in my art, and she looked tired, like she'd finally come to terms with the reality of my choice. We had a long talk that night. She didn't apologize, but she did ask questions, for the first time trying to understand why this mattered to me. "You were supposed to be our success story," she whispered, as if talking to herself more than to me. "We thought you'd make us proud." Her words stung, but I took a deep breath and told her how art made me feel, how it filled a part of me that nothing else ever had, and how much I wished they could be proud of me for following my own path, not theirs. She didn't say much when she left, but I could tell something had shifted. She didn't mention my career again, and for the next year, there was a tense but quieter acceptance. My dad and siblings still kept their distance, barely acknowledging my art or my progress. It wasn't until the gallery debut that things changed. I'd sent invitations to everyone, not expecting any of them to come. But to my shock, they showed up, dressed in their best, looking awkward and uncomfortable in the art world setting. As they walked through the gallery, seeing my work hung proudly on the walls, I saw them glancing at each other, whispering, pointing at pieces, recognizing bits of our family history woven into my paintings. One of my pieces, a large, bold canvas representing my journey and struggles, seemed to catch my dad's attention. He stood in front of it for a long time, just staring, and I could see his eyes softening, the disappointment easing just a little. After the show, he approached me, and for the first time, he looked at me not with judgment, but with a hint of respect. "You really made something of yourself," he said quietly. It wasn't an apology, and it didn't erase the years of tension, but it was a start. My family still doesn't fully understand my choice, and they may never see art the way I do, but now they're beginning to accept that my path, while different, is just as valid as theirs. And in that small step, I found a strange kind of peace. It was a Friday night when I stepped into my usual bar, a dimly lit place where the whiskey was always smooth and the atmosphere felt like home. I had just finished a long week at work, drained by endless meetings and emails. The jukebox played a mix of old rock and blues, and I settled into my favorite corner booth, ordering a whiskey neat, just the way I liked it. As the hours rolled by, the bar filled with the usual chatter of laughter and clinking glasses, but I found myself lost in thought, the weight of my week hanging over me. It was then that I noticed her. A woman sat alone at the bar, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders as she sipped a cocktail. There was something striking about her, an aura of melancholy that drew me in. She caught my eye briefly, and I felt a spark of connection, an unspoken understanding. I wrestled with the idea of approaching her but ultimately decided against it, opting instead to nurse my drink and let the night unfold. After a while, she rose from her seat and made her way toward me. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice smooth and soft. I nodded, surprised by my own heart racing. We introduced ourselves, and her name was Claire. We talked as if we were old friends, sharing stories about our lives with effortless ease. She mentioned how she had just moved to the city, seeking a fresh start after a rough breakup. I couldn't help but share my own struggles, the weight of loneliness that seemed to follow me even in crowded places. Claire listened intently, her eyes reflecting a deep empathy that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. Time slipped away, and before I knew it, the bar was beginning to empty. I'd lost track of the conversation, completely absorbed in her presence. I found myself mesmerized not only by her beauty but by the raw honesty and kindness she exuded. Just as I was about to suggest we grab another drink, an unsettling thing happened. A few men in the corner were laughing a bit too loudly, one of them making crude jokes. I glanced over, feeling my heart drop as one of them pointed at Claire, whispering something that made the others burst into mocking laughter. A surge of anger rose within me. How dare they? I shot them a glare, hoping to convey my contempt. Claire noticed and squeezed my hand gently. "It's fine," she said, her voice calm. But it wasn't fine. These weren't just drunken idiots, they were the kind of people who thought cruelty was a joke. I wanted to stand up, to confront them, but I sensed that Claire would stop me. Yes, I had never met anyone so calm and collected. She seemed like someone who could handle her own. So, I took a breath, forcing myself to focus on her instead. I tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, laughing about the absurdity of life, and slowly but surely, her smile returned. As the clock struck midnight, Claire and I shared one last laugh, reminiscing unpleasant tales of past relationships. I suggested we hang out again, and for a brief second, our eyes met with a spark of interest. She grinned, and I felt myself getting lost once again in her laughter. "Sure, I'd like that." She stood, calculating her next words with precision. "But I have to tell you something first." I noticed a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "Before we part ways, there's something you should know. Even though I just met you, I feel a connection that's rare. You have this light, an unexpected warmth, and that," she paused, searching for the right words, "makes me feel safe." I couldn't comprehend what she said. I was accustomed to being overlooked, the kind of face that blended in, average at best. In moments like these, compliments felt awkward, the kind I never took seriously. But Claire's words hung in the air, altering the very fabric of my perception. "You don't mean that," I finally stammered, the disbelief coating my tone. "I do. You might not see it, but trust me, it exists. You're kind, and that alone is enough to draw someone in." She smiled, and everything about that moment struck a chord deep within. I was flattered yet confused, her words danced on the edge of something I longed to believe but had never experienced. My confidence had always been shaky, but Claire made me feel as if I belonged, even in a world filled with chaos. Before she left, she leaned in, leaving a soft kiss on my cheek, the gesture feeling both electric and soothing. It was such a simple moment, yet it left me buzzing, a strange mix of joy and disbelief swirling within. "I'll see you soon, okay?" she whispered, and then she walked away, her silhouette fading into the city lights. I left the bar that night with my head spinning, a sense of hope blooming inside me for the first time in years. I even texted her the next day, my apprehension mingling with excitement. "Thanks for last night. I had a great time." Hours passed without a response. This made sense, she probably had a busy life. But the nagging feeling of doubt started to creep in. Maybe I'd overstepped, made her feel uncomfortable, or maybe, just maybe, she was just being polite. I tried not to dwell on it, but when I woke up the next day and checked again, there was still nothing. Days turned into weeks, and my attempts to reach out grew more frantic, each unanswered message making the compliment she had given me feel like a taunt, a cruel reminder of someone who had ignited a spark only to vanish. I couldn't understand why she hadn't reciprocated. I replayed our conversation in my mind, dissecting every moment, every word. Was it too much? Was it too little? As time dragged on, I slid back into the heavy blanket of loneliness. The unexpected compliment felt more like an ironic punchline now, a cruel twist of fate that mocked what I had desperately wanted. My world returned to gray, filled with work and weary routines. It was like the light she claimed to see had dimmed and gone out. But then, about a month later, I found myself returning to that same bar, hoping to shake off the gloom. I sat in my usual booth with a whiskey in hand when, to my absolute shock, Claire walked in. I couldn't believe my eyes. Suddenly, the weeks of disappointment evaporated, and my heart raced. This time, she looked different, more serious and distant. She made her way to the bar, and I felt compelled to approach her. "Claire," I called, my voice barely breaking through the noise. She turned, surprise flickering across her face. "Hey," she said, her tone friendly, though her eyes betrayed a hint of apprehension. I felt a whirlwind of relief and anxiety flood over me as I struggled for words. I miss hearing from you, I said, trying to sound more casual than I felt. I thought we had a connection, she sighed, her expression softening. I know, and I'm really sorry. Things got complicated. She hesitated, clearly grappling with her thoughts. I leaned closer, encouraging her to share. What happened? Her eyes darted away, and she glanced toward the back of the bar, avoiding my gaze. It's hard to explain. I just needed some space. I was going through a lot, and I didn't mean to ghost you. A lump formed in my throat, emotions cascading through me. I wanted to tell her that her words had sparked something beautiful within me, but it seemed misplaced, shadowed by her hesitation. Claire, listen, whatever you're dealing with, you don't have to go through it alone. She looked back at me, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of hope. I really appreciate that, I do. But I have a lot to figure out. There was a heaviness in her words, a weight I couldn't fully understand. Just then, the same group from that night, the ones joking and mocking, walked in, raucous laughter ringing out. Claire visibly stiffened, and my instincts kicked in. I shot them a nasty glare. She noticed and put her hand on my arm, her fingers warm against my skin. Don't, she warned, her voice low. They don't matter. But I couldn't just stand there, heat surged through me at the thought of anyone treating her disrespectfully. As they drew nearer, I felt my heart racing. Hey, look who it is. One of the men shouted, the joy fading from his face as he recognized Claire. Hey there, sweetheart, you miss us? The laughter rippled around them, and I felt my blood boil. You need to back off, I said, adrenaline pushing me forward. Leave her alone. Claire grabbed my arm tightly. No, please don't, she urged me softly, fear threading through her voice. Let it go, just let it go. But I couldn't let it go. You can't let them, I'll be fine. The steel in her voice cut through my anger. I stared dumbfounded at her, hating that she was telling me to stand down. Just as I was about to respond, one of the men stepped forward, jabbing a finger at me. You'd better watch your mouth, loser. Claire caught my eye, her expression shifting. It's fine, she insisted firmly. I can handle myself. My world felt upside down. The warmth I had felt moments before vanished, replaced by a chill. You don't deserve this, Claire, I said softly, yet my anger felt more directed toward her than them now. Maybe you should keep that in mind, she shot back, her eyes suddenly filled with a fierce intensity. I felt a wave of confusion crash over me, wondering why she was defending these bastards. But then I realized it was about her autonomy, her strength. Realizing I wasn't helping, I held my breath, restraining myself. Meanwhile, Claire faced them with an unexpected courage. You think you're funny? She said, her voice steady. You're pathetic. Silence hung in the air like a thick fog, the laughter fading as they processed her words. I felt my heart thud in my chest, both in concern for Claire and in admiration. You don't know me, one of them grumbled. You think you're better than us? Better? No, Claire responded, unwavering. But I know I deserve better than this. In a twist, the men exchanged glances, confusion morphing into hostility. We're just having some fun. The other attempted to shrug it off but failed to mask his irritation. It dawned on me, Claire had taken a stand, she wasn't cowering, she was resilient. I watched in awe as she navigated the moment, the respect I had for her growing with each passing second. This isn't fun, this is bullying, she asserted. Maybe you should think about finding something meaningful in your lives. Their faces shifted a bit, pausing to absorb the weight of her challenge. Then one of them let out a short chuckle, opting to dismiss her stance. Whatever. You're no one, sweetheart. Just like that, I felt her deflate slightly at those words. I expected anger or defiance, but her eyes glossed over, the spark fading as if those words struck deep. Claire turned back to me, and I instinctively took her hand, grounding her. Don't let them get to you, Claire. I felt helpless. She and I connected as strangers, but now we were so much more, woven together in unexpected ways. I'm tired of fighting, she murmured, squeezing my fingers. Tired of proving myself. You're incredible, I managed to say, my heart racing. You have a way of standing firm. And with that, the tension hung thick, as if the air demanded a reckoning between us and the men lingering like ominous shadows. The momentary silence morphed into a standoff, and I steeled myself for anything. But then Claire stepped away, pulling me toward the exit. "Let's go," she whispered, urgency spilling from her voice. "You sure?" I glanced, half expecting the men to retaliate with something more sinister, but Claire was resolute. "Let's just go." As we walked out, I felt the weight of the world shift slightly. The unexpected compliment lingered in my mind, transforming into a powerful force that transcended my initial disbelief. Somehow, that moment felt monumental. She had affirmed my worth just as I had attempted to affirm hers. Outside, the cool air hit my face like a welcome balm. We moved away from the bar, leaving the chaos behind. "You okay?" I asked softly, searching for any sign of distress. She nodded, taking a deep breath as we turned a corner. "Just tired," she replied. "I'm sorry for everything." I shook my head. "No, don't apologize. You were amazing back there." A small smile broke through her exhaustion, a flicker of light illuminating her features. "Thank you." Just then, her phone buzzed violently in her pocket. She fished it out, quickly checking the screen before cursing under her breath. "Sorry, I have to take this." She stepped away, her expression turning serious as she answered. I stood a few paces behind, feeling a mix of concern and hope. Listening to her soft voice, I couldn't help but reflect on everything she had shared. Claire had unexpectedly complimented me that night, her words had planted a seed of confidence. I would be lying if I didn't admit that the idea of more origin stories leading back to her deeply intrigued me, yet it all felt precarious. As she ended her call, she returned to me. "I should really head home," she said, her demeanor more reserved. I swallowed the lump in my throat, wrestling with a conflict I couldn't openly express. "Okay," I said slowly. "Can I see you again? I just don't want this to be the last time." I watched as uncertainty flickered across her face. She opened her mouth to respond, yet no words came. Then finally, she nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that. I should reach out." Despite the unevenness of her resolve, it felt like a meaningful step. We exchanged numbers, and in that moment, something crystallized within me. Maybe we were just two wounded souls navigating a chaotic world, but that night, the unexpected compliment had transformed into an acknowledgement of genuine connection as it hollowed the darkness of our lives. With one final embrace, Claire stepped away, and as she disappeared into the night, I stood alone, realizing that the most unexpected compliment I ever received wasn't just a fleeting comment but the beginning of something more profound than I had ever anticipated. It was a reminder that kindness and warmth can shine even amid the darkest moments, and sometimes, love can appear when you least expect it, just waiting for you to embrace it.